It begins with a tragedy so bizarre, so horrifying, that it gripped the nation in disbelief. On January 26, 2001, residents of a San Francisco apartment building heard the screams of a woman in distress. In the hallway, Diane Whipple, a lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College, was attacked by a massive Presa Canario dog named Bane. The dog mauled her viciously, leaving her with injuries so catastrophic that she would not survive. The case stunned the public. How could something like this happen in one of America's most affluent cities? But as reporters dug deeper, the story only grew stranger. The dogs didn't simply belong to a careless pet owner. They had been bred, raised, and placed into the hands of two eccentric San Francisco lawyers, Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel, who lived in the same building as Whipple. And behind them, pulling the strings from the shadows of a prison cell, was a man the public had never heard of before: Paul Cornfed Schneider. To outsiders, Schneider was just another violent inmate in California's notorious prison system. But to investigators and prosecutors, he was far more than that. Schneider was a ranking member of the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most feared prison gangs in America. From inside his cell at Pelican Bay State Prison, he orchestrated a series of criminal enterprises, from drug trafficking and robberies to breeding vicious dogs under the name Dog O' War. The name Cornfed might have sounded harmless, almost comical, but those who knew him understood it was a dangerous misnomer. Schneider was not a country farm boy with a gentle demeanor. He was a man who had built a reputation on violence, cunning, and ruthless ambition. Already serving life sentences for a string of brutal crimes, he continued to exert influence in ways that defied the very idea of prison walls. As the details of the Whipple case unfolded, Schneider's name became synonymous with both cruelty and control. The media portrayed him as a puppet master, orchestrating chaos from behind bars. Headlines described his twisted relationships with Noel and Knoller, his bizarre adoption into their family, and the monstrous dogs he had bred for unclear but sinister purposes. But the Whipple mauling, shocking as it was only one chapter in a much larger, darker story. Schneider had been building his reputation long before that fateful day in 2001. To understand the man at the center of this strange saga, one must look back into the violent world of California's prison system, the rise of the Aryan Brotherhood, and the ruthless ambition of a man who refused to be forgotten, even while locked in a cage. This is the story of Paul Cornfed Schneider, a story of crime, power, betrayal, and notoriety. A story that reveals how a single inmate could manipulate lawyers, command killers, and even shock the nation with a tragedy that no one saw coming. The early years of Paul Cornfed Schneider remain shrouded in mystery. Unlike many infamous criminals, there are a few childhood anecdotes, no dramatic tales of a troubled youth that explain how he became the man he was. What we do know is that Schneider wasted no time in building a reputation as a lawbreaker. A federal report would later describe him bluntly: he wasted little time beginning a life of crime as a young adult. That phrase, wasted little time, captures the urgency with which he pursued a criminal path. While most young men his age were graduating high school, starting jobs, or entering college, Schneider was already laying the foundation of a career built on violence and crime. His juvenile record hinted at petty offenses, but by the time he became an adult, the offenses escalated quickly. Schneider didn't just break the law, he seemed determined to defy it at every turn. His introduction to California's justice system came early and decisively. Arrests mounted, and prison gates swung open for him while he was still a young man. But unlike many who enter the system frightened vulnerable, or intent on rehabilitation, Schneider adapted almost seamlessly. The prison environment, brutal, hierarchical, unforgiving, was where he thrived. It rewarded strength, manipulation, and a willingness to commit acts of violence without hesitation. Schneider had all of these qualities. Inside, he learned the rules of survival. For white inmates in California's notoriously divided prison system, allegiance to a gang was not optional. It was survival. The Aryan Brotherhood, with its iron grip on white prison politics, became both a refuge and a proving ground. Schneider was not content to simply survive. He wanted to rise. He studied the codes, proved himself in conflicts, and demonstrated the ruthlessness the Brotherhood demanded of its members. This ambition was accompanied by an intelligence that set him apart. He wasn't a mindless thug. He was calculating. Every act of violence, every display of loyalty, was a step toward power within the Brotherhood's carefully guarded hierarchy. Unlike the chaotic violence of street gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood valued discipline and obedience. Schneider understood this, and more importantly, he used it. One early incident would showcase just how far he was willing to go. In 1990, while appearing in a courthouse, Schneider carried out an attack that shocked even hardened observers. Concealing a makeshift knife inside his own body cavity to evade searches, he lunged at a defense attorney, stabbing him 4 times. The victim survived, but the message was clear. Paul Schneider was willing to risk everything to prove his dominance. The courtroom attack earned him not just another life sentence, but also notoriety within the prison world. By the time most men his age were starting families or careers, Schneider was cementing his reputation as a violent enforcer. Prison was not a place of punishment for him. It was the arena in which he carved out an identity. The man who would one day manipulate lawyers and breed killer dogs was already establishing himself as someone who thrived in chaos and who would stop at nothing to climb higher. For most inmates, the California prison system is a crushing weight. It strips away freedom, dignity, and control. But for Paul Cornfed Schneider, prison was not a cage. It was an empire waiting to be built. Inside the walls of California's toughest facilities, Schneider aligned himself with one of the deadliest organizations in America, the Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood, or AB, was more than just a prison gang. By the time Schneider entered the system, the Brotherhood had evolved into a nationwide criminal syndicate. Its members enforced strict codes of loyalty and violence. Betrayal meant death. Obedience, however, could mean power, money, and influence. To prove himself worthy of the Brotherhood's ranks, Schneider did not hesitate. Violence was his calling card. The 1990 courthouse stabbing of a defense attorney demonstrated his brutality and cunning. Concealing a homemade knife inside his own body cavity, he attacked without hesitation, leaving the stunned courtroom in chaos. The attorney survived, but Schneider's reputation soared. Few inmates would dare such a brazen act. Fewer still would carry it out with such calculated precision. For the Aryan Brotherhood, this was exactly the kind of man they needed. Ruthless, fearless, and completely committed to the gang's dominance. Over time, Schneider rose through the Brotherhood's ranks. He became known not just as an enforcer, but as a strategist. From inside California's Pelican Bay State Prison, Schneider managed to turn confinement into control. He learned how to smuggle drugs, move money, and direct violent operations on the outside. While guards believed they were locking him away, Schneider was, in fact, running a business, one fueled by methamphetamine and bloodshed. But his rise wasn't just about money. Power inside prison required constant shows of force. For the Aryan Brotherhood, respect was earned through violence. Schneider's name became linked with assaults, intimidation, and gang-ordered hits. His influence extended far beyond the walls of his cell block. When orders came down from him, associates on the outside listened. One of the darkest examples of his power was tied to the 1995 murder of Sonoma County Sheriff's Deputy Frank Trejo. The deputy was killed during a robbery carried out by an Aryan Brotherhood associate, a crime connected directly to Schneider's prison-orchestrated empire. Even from behind bars, he could cause blood to spill on the streets, claiming the life of a man who had sworn to uphold the law. This kind of reach cemented his status inside the Brotherhood. Few inmates could boast of such control. Fewer still could command loyalty with such fear. Schneider had become exactly what the Aryan Brotherhood valued: a leader who could thrive under pressure, bend the system to his will, and prove that prison walls were never enough to contain the organization's ambitions. But power inside the Brotherhood came with a cost. It meant constant attention from law enforcement, suspicion from prison officials, and the expectation that violence would never stop. Paul Schneider had climbed high within one of America's deadliest gangs. And as history would soon show, he had no intention of slowing down. For most inmates, a life sentence means exactly that: a slow fade into obscurity, sealed away from society, powerless to affect the world outside. But Paul "Cornfed" Schneider defied that fate. From the depths of California's maximum security prisons, he continued to live as though the walls did not exist. His cell became his office, his gang became his workforce, and the streets of California remained his hunting ground. At Pelican Bay State Prison, a facility designed to hold California's most dangerous men, Schneider found a way to turn confinement into command. Using contraband phones, coded letters, and trusted intermediaries, he built a criminal enterprise that spanned both sides of the prison walls. The Aryan Brotherhood, already a feared syndicate, relied on men like Schneider to keep the machinery of crime in motion. Drugs had to be moved, debts had to be collected, and enemies had to be silenced. Schneider excelled at all three. He became deeply involved in smuggling methamphetamine, arranging deals through outside associates who funneled profits back to the Brotherhood. These operations were lucrative, feeding not only the gang's coffers, but also Schneider's reputation as a man who could generate money even while chained to a cell. In the prison world, financial power translated directly into influence. It meant protection, loyalty, and respect. But Schneider's empire was not built on business alone. Violence was its foundation. When robberies were needed to fund operations, Schneider gave the orders. When debts went unpaid, Schneider authorized retribution. Each decision carried deadly consequences, none more tragic than the events of 1995. That year, an Aryan Brotherhood associate carried out a robbery that ended with the murder of Sonoma County Sheriff's Deputy Frank Trejo. Trejo was a decorated officer, a husband, and a father. His death shocked the community, a stark reminder that prison walls could not shield the public from men like Schneider. Even though Schneider was locked inside a maximum security prison, his fingerprints were all over the crime. Investigators would later connect him to the operation that cost Trejo his life. The brazenness of orchestrating such crimes from behind bars baffled the public. But to law enforcement, it was part of a grim pattern. The Aryan Brotherhood had long shown that its members were most dangerous inside prison, where they were insulated from retaliation and able to use the system's own flaws against it. Schneider embodied that reality. He was untouchable behind walls, but lethal beyond them. Each act of violence, each smuggled package of meth, reinforced his status as a key player in the Brotherhood. His reputation became both his weapon and his shield. Fellow inmates feared him, associates obeyed him, and law enforcement knew his name as one of the most dangerous men they could not reach. But this life of command would come at a price. The more Schneider built his empire, the more attention he drew. Journalists, investigators, and even the public began to learn his name. And soon, one of his strangest ventures, a bizarre dog-breeding enterprise, would drag him out of the shadows and into the harsh glare of national headlines. By the late 1990s, Paul "Cornfed" Schneider was already a notorious figure inside the California prison system. He had orchestrated robberies, overseen drug operations, and held sway within the Aryan Brotherhood. But in the shadows of his criminal empire, Schneider embarked on a venture so unusual, so strange, that it would ultimately draw more attention than any act of violence he had ever committed. That venture was dog breeding. The breed in question was the Presa Canario, a massive Spanish mastiff with a fearsome reputation. Muscular, territorial, and bred historically for guarding livestock, these dogs were known for their strength and aggression. Schneider and his cellmate, fellow Aryan Brotherhood member Dale Breches, began raising Presa Canarios through a business they called Dog O' War. On the surface, it looked like a legitimate kennel operation. But investigators and prosecutors would later suggest a darker purpose. These weren't ordinary pets. The dogs were suspected of being bred either for high-stakes dogfighting or as enforcers, animals trained to guard methamphetamine labs and intimidate anyone who crossed the gang. Running a breeding business from inside a maximum security prison might sound impossible, but Schneider's manipulative skills made it work. He enlisted the help of outsiders, none more significant than San Francisco attorneys Marjorie Knoller and Robert Noel. The couple was eccentric and eager to become involved with Schneider's world. What began as correspondence with an inmate soon spiraled into a disturbing partnership. Through letters, many of them sexually explicit, Schneider cultivated a bizarre bond with Knoller and Noel. So strong was the connection that the lawyers eventually adopted Schneider as their legal son, an arrangement that blurred the line between manipulation and obsession. The adoption gave Schneider trusted proxies on the outside, people willing to handle his affairs and take custody of his animals. That custody came in the form of two massive Presa Canarios named Bane and Hera. Knoller and Noel, who lived in a San Francisco apartment building, became the owners of Schneider's dogs. Neighbors were quickly alarmed. The animals were enormous, uncontrollable, and aggressive. Complaints began piling up, but the couple ignored the warnings. To them, these were not just pets. They were extensions of Schneider's will, living symbols of his control even from within a prison cell. The presence of the dogs, combined with the strange adoption, raised eyebrows among those who knew the couple. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors struggled to make sense of why two seasoned attorneys would risk everything to tie themselves to a convicted Aryan Brotherhood member. Yet to Schneider, the arrangement made perfect sense. He had created a pipeline from prison to the outside world, one that gave him loyal followers, legal cover, and a pair of living weapons. No one could have predicted just how devastating that arrangement would become. In January 2001, the dogs would unleash a tragedy that made national headlines. Schneider's kennel business, his bizarre relationship with two attorneys, and his obsession with control would all converge in one horrific moment, the fatal mauling of Diane Whipple. On January 26, 2001, a quiet San Francisco apartment building became the scene of one of the most shocking and gruesome tragedies in recent memory. That afternoon, Diane Whipple, a 33-year-old lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College, returned home carrying groceries. She had no idea that waiting in the hallway were two Prisa Canario dogs belonging to her neighbors, the animals Schneider had placed in the care of attorneys Marjorie Knoller and Robert Knoll. One of the dogs, a 140-pound male named Bain, lunged. In seconds, the calm of the hallway exploded into chaos. Witnesses later described hearing Whipple's screams, the sound of the dog's snarls, and frantic banging as neighbors tried desperately to intervene. But the attack was relentless. Bain mauled Whipple with terrifying ferocity, inflicting catastrophic injuries. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Diane Whipple had suffered fatal wounds. The horror of the attack reverberated across the city and quickly across the nation. San Francisco, a city known for its cosmopolitan culture and progressive values, had become the backdrop for a crime scene that felt medieval in its brutality. News outlets seized on the story, plastering the dog's images across television screens and front pages. But soon, the attention shifted from the animals to their owners, and then, inevitably, to the man pulling strings from behind bars. Paul Cornfed Schneider. Investigators traced the Presa Canarios back to Schneider and his prison-based breeding business, Doggo War. What at first seemed like an inexplicable freak accident began to look more like the fallout of a reckless criminal enterprise. Why were two lawyers harboring Schneider's dogs? Why had they ignored repeated warnings from neighbors and colleagues about the animal's danger? And how had a prison gang member come to orchestrate such a bizarre arrangement from his cell in Pelican Bay? The legal fallout was swift and unprecedented. Marjorie Knoller and Robert Knoll were charged in connection with the Whipple's death. For prosecutors, the case was clear. They had knowingly kept vicious, uncontrollable animals and failed to protect their neighbors from the danger. Knoller, who was present during the attack and failed to stop it, faced the harshest consequences. In a stunning decision, she was convicted of second-degree murder, a virtually unheard-of charge in a dog attack case. Knoll was convicted of lesser charges, but both saw their careers and reputations destroyed. The case became a legal milestone, setting precedent for how the law could hold individuals accountable for reckless ownership that leads to death. And yet behind it all loomed Schneider's shadow. He was never charged in connection with Whipple's death, but his fingerprints were everywhere. The breeding business, the bizarre adoption by Knoller and Knoll, and the very presence of the animals that killed her. The Diane Whipple case transformed Schneider from an obscure prison gang figure into a household name. No longer was he simply Cornfed, the violent Aryan Brotherhood inmate. He was the man whose twisted control and bizarre manipulation helped set the stage for one of the most infamous tragedies in California history. In the aftermath of the Diane Whipple mauling, the public's attention turned not just to the tragic death of a promising young woman, but to the strange and unsettling figure who seemed to hover over the case. Paul Cornfed Schneider. For years, Schneider's name had been familiar only to law enforcement, prosecutors, and prison officials. But now, through headlines and nightly news broadcasts, his story entered American living rooms. Reporters scrambled to understand him. Who was this man who could run a dog breeding business from inside one of California's most secure prisons? Who was the inmate that two seasoned attorneys had chosen to adopt as their son? The more journalists dug, the more surreal the picture became. It was not just about dogs or lawyers. It was about control, manipulation, and the terrifying reach of the Aryan Brotherhood. For Schneider, the media frenzy presented both an opportunity and a danger. Against all odds, he decided to seize the spotlight. He granted interviews to news organizations, answering questions about his role in the Whipple case. He even spoke at length with Rolling Stone magazine, offering a rare glimpse into his life, his crimes, and his thoughts about the tragedy that had brought his name into the national spotlight. In those interviews, Schneider expressed something few expected: regret. He told reporters that he wished Diane Whipple had never died, that he never intended for his dogs to be used in such a reckless way. Whether these words reflected genuine remorse or a calculated effort to soften his image remains a matter of debate. But one thing was certain. By speaking publicly, Schneider had crossed a line that few in the Aryan Brotherhood would dare to cross. For the Brotherhood, silence was sacred. The gang's survival depended on secrecy, loyalty, and an unwavering refusal to cooperate with outsiders. Media interviews were considered an unforgivable betrayal, a violation of the code that kept members alive and the organization strong. Schneider's decision to share his story with reporters was not just reckless, it was dangerous. Inside prison walls, word spread quickly. Aryan Brotherhood leaders were furious. They saw Schneider's media appearances as self-serving and disloyal, a way to elevate his name at the expense of the gang's code. His expression of regret over Whipple's death was seen not as a humanizing moment, but as weakness, and weakness had no place in the Brotherhood. Almost overnight, Schneider's standing within the gang shifted. From a respected shot caller and moneymaker, he became a liability. Rumors began circulating. Schneider was marked for assassination. His decision to step into the media spotlight, to speak when silence was demanded, had placed the target squarely on his back. The betrayal cut both ways. To Schneider, the Brotherhood had been the vehicle for his rise, but now it was his greatest threat. To the Brotherhood, Schneider had once been an asset, but now he was a traitor. And in the ruthless world of prison gangs, there was only one punishment for betrayal: death. The Aryan Brotherhood is not an organization that forgives. It thrives on loyalty, demands silence, and punishes betrayal with blood. For Paul "Cornfed" Schneider, his decision to speak to the media in the wake of the Diane Whipple mauling was more than a miscalculation. It was a death sentence. Inside prison, word spread fast. Schneider's interviews, particularly his candid reflections in Rolling Stone, had crossed an unspoken but ironclad boundary. By publicly discussing his life and expressing regret for Whipple's death, he had stepped outside the Brotherhood's code. What to the outside world seemed like a rare moment of humanity was, in the eyes of the gang, an unforgivable act of weakness. And weakness, within the Brotherhood, was the same as betrayal. Leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood began whispering his name. Reports circulated that he had been greenlit, marked for assassination. For an inmate who had once commanded fear and respect, the shift was dramatic. Men who had once carried out his orders now looked at him with suspicion. To the Brotherhood, Schneider was no longer a soldier or a leader. He was a liability. The situation grew worse as rumors spread that Schneider might be cooperating with authorities. His transfer to a federal medical facility fueled speculation. To prison gangs, transfers like this often carried a stigma. Why would the system protect a man unless he had given something in return? Whether or not Schneider was actually informing became irrelevant. Perception mattered more than truth, and the perception was that he had betrayed the Brotherhood. Isolation became his only shield. Officials recognized the danger he faced and placed him in settings where the Brotherhood's reach was limited. In effect, Schneider was living in exile, still imprisoned, but cut off from the gang that had once defined his identity. For a man who had climbed so high in the Brotherhood, this was both survival and humiliation. The fall was a sharp contrast to his earlier power. Once, he had orchestrated drug smuggling operations, ordered robberies, and even reached into the outside world with his bizarre dog-breeding enterprise. Now he was a marked man, surviving not through strength or loyalty, but through the protections of the very system he had manipulated for so long. In interviews, Schneider seemed to understand his precarious position. He no longer spoke with the bravado of a prison shot-caller. Instead, he reflected on the choices that had brought him there, the lines he had crossed, and the enemies he could never escape. The Aryan Brotherhood had condemned him, and once condemned, there was no coming back. In the end, Schneider's fall from grace was as dramatic as his rise. He had played the dangerous game of power inside one of the deadliest prison gangs in America. And for a time, he had won. But ambition, ego, and a desire to control the narrative pushed him too far. The gang that once shielded him now hunted him. And in that betrayal, Schneider learned the most brutal rule of all. No one walks away from the Aryan Brotherhood unscathed. By the early 2000s, Paul Cornfed Schneider had lived 2 lifetimes inside prison walls. First as a rising soldier of the Aryan Brotherhood, then as an outcast marked for death. His fall from favor left him vulnerable, but it also created an unexpected opportunity. For the first time, Schneider's survival depended not on his gang's protection, but on the federal system he had spent years defying. In 2003, Schneider stood in federal court facing charges tied to his long criminal career. Among them was his role in the 1995 robbery that claimed the life of Sonoma County Sheriff's Deputy Frank Trago. For law enforcement, this was personal. An officer had been murdered and they wanted accountability, even if the mastermind had already been serving life sentences in state prison. Schneider pleaded guilty. The court handed down yet another life sentence, his third. But this conviction came with a critical change. Instead of remaining in California's prisons, where the Aryan Brotherhood still held enormous sway, Schneider was transferred into federal custody. For him, this was both punishment and salvation. On one hand, the federal system meant stricter controls, fewer chances to run outside operations, and an environment designed to strip away the power he once wielded. On the other hand, it removed him from the reach of his enemies within the Brotherhood. In federal custody, Schneider was finally beyond their immediate grasp. To outsiders, this might have looked like justice catching up with a man who had spent his life orchestrating crime and chaos. But to Schneider, the transfer was a strange kind of victory. For years, he had been living with the constant threat of assassination. Now, in federal prison, he could at least breathe without wondering if the next Aryan Brotherhood soldier who crossed his path would be his executioner. Still, the price of that safety was steep. In the federal system, Schneider was just another lifer, stripped of the influence he had once enjoyed in California. His ability to command outside operations diminished. His name, once whispered in prison yards as a symbol of authority, now carried a different weight. That of a man who had been cast out, condemned by his own. He adapted, as he always had. But the days of orchestrating robberies and running meth pipelines were gone. In their place was a quieter existence, punctuated only by the occasional media inquiry or legal development tied to his past crimes. Schneider had gone from being a feared shot caller in one of the nation's deadliest gangs to a man living in exile, watched over not by loyal soldiers, but by federal guards. Yet in a strange way, exile was the outcome he had hoped for. His survival depended on the very system he had tried to manipulate. a system that now held him securely away from the gang that once defined him. For Paul Cornfed Schneider, federal custody was not freedom, but it was the closest thing to it he would ever know.